Isn't this a serene scene? A Loon moon. It started as a fabric collage, and I added hand stitch layer upon layer. Join me for the whole process from start to finish. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. I'm making a new collage today, and this is the idea I've had. If you've seen my other video of this chickadee, you'll know that this moon was added by special request. And so I've decided to do another piece with a moon. This time what I was thinking of is a landscape. Well, here's a landscape I've made before. It seems to me that most times when I make a landscape, I like to make it not square, but more of a rectangular shape. So this is the shape that I'm going to work with. So I've just thrown a couple of pieces of fabric down. I haven't decided on the collage. And here's the shape of the moon. This is a needle puller. And this is what inspired the moon in this piece. The moon ended up being smaller. But this is where it all came from my special art advisor, my 2-year-old granddaughter. So I thought that maybe a nice dark sky would be nice, so I pulled out this piece of really nice navy dyed fabric. Thought this piece had some really nice movement on it and colors. And then I thought that this could be representing some ground, trees, greenery, something like that, hills. And so I thought I would do a really big moon. Maybe not as big as this, but maybe as big as this, I'm not sure. And then I thought a lighter color would be nice. So I have this little piece of dyed fabric that's quite faded, and it almost looks like faded jeans. So I think what I'll do is I'll try cutting out a piece of fabric from this and see if I like this up against this navy, and then maybe work from there. I've grabbed some other pieces like this fuchsia color. I have a piece with green on it with some other colors, and I also have this piece which has multiple colors on it and kind of a fuchsia background. I'm going to start from there and maybe bring in some more fabrics if I'm not finding exactly what I'm looking for. But what I'm going to do first of all is trace this moon, this needle puller I'm going to use as my template. I'm going to use my marker, my fabric marker. This is a fabric marker that marks in purple and it disappears in the air over time. I find with this particular one, there's different brands that you can get depending on where you live and what's available. And this particular one I find fades fairly quickly, which usually works really well for me. I don't need it to stay long. So I've got that traced out. And now I'm just gonna cut it out. I'm gonna use these purple lines as my guide, but I'm also not gonna be too fussy about making it perfect because it's gonna distort and change as I stitch it. And later stages in the stitching is when I can get really precise if I feel like that's important to me. I also don't have to make this a full round moon. I could change the shape of it if I want to, but I'm going to start with this full moon and see what I think. So that's not bad. That might be nice. I may want an even lighter color to make it more of like almost like a silver moon. And I'll start there and see what I think. What I'm thinking about is to have hills similar to how there is a hill or a mountain in this piece, to have something with a shape like that in the sky. And so if I have the sky very dark because it's nighttime, I think all the colors should reflect that it's night. I do like this color, so I want it to be part of it. My other option is to not use such a dark color in the background. I initially thought of maybe making this my moon color, which I could do. I have more of this fabric. It doesn't show up if I made this my sky. This moon would have to be lighter, but this could also be the sky. There's almost like a moon shape in this gold here that is on this batik fabric. So see, I like how that is so much lighter. So what I might want to do is have the sky be lighter and my moon even lighter than this. I'm just going to grab some more fabrics and audition some more pieces and see what I think. Okay, I've grabbed some of my text fabric. This is from my Spoonflower shop. I've grabbed a gray. I've grabbed this grayish blue color. I also have this piece of silk in blue that may be nice. So what I'm thinking about is that I want this piece to include a moon. So that's one thing I do know about it. So I am going to try to build everything that I'm doing around the idea of a moon. And that gives me an anchor point and somewhere to start. So I have this one moon as a possibility. What I'm thinking now, looking at the fabrics, of course, I have this gray, which is just a plain cotton light gray. I have this text fabric, which might be interesting. And I have this light blue, which is lighter than this dyed fabric that I have. I think if I can decide what I want to be the sky that's behind the moon, then that may help me to make a new choice about the moon color. I'm going to try this because I think it's a fun idea. So I'm going to do, this is printed only on one side. So maybe I will trace it on the back. I could trace it on the back or the front. Either one would work. I just happen to have this snippet of fabric available with the text, and the reason I picked this particular scrap is because the moon's going to have text all around it, which I thought would give me lots of options for stitching. There's other areas that would have gaps, which may be a good thing depending on what you're cutting out. But I thought in this case, I would use an area that has the printing throughout. If I use this batik as my background, that's what it would look like. That could work. That might be nice. And then because there is writing on there, and it may draw the eye, especially if someone is looking at this close up, decide if I want to have this writing in a particular orientation. And kind of like the lines of the writing being vertical on that. These are all just little decisions. You know, diagonal might be nice too. So that's something that I'll decide once I have more of the background figured out. And it shows up a bit better. Why don't I test it out? On here it looks really nice too. I think maybe I am going to use this as my moon because I like it. So now it's just a matter of figuring out what I want for my collage. If I turn this piece this way, that might help inform a mountain or a hill. So now I'm just going to play with fabrics, move them around, and settle on a collage for this piece. I'm working on felt. This is acrylic felt, and the size I'm working on is about 4.5, not quite 4 3/4 tall, and 3.5 wide. So it's fairly small, which will give me lots of options as I start to build the collage. I can use so many of my tiny pieces of fabric. So I'm adding more of the navy strips, and then I'm coming in with this batik which is the piece that I'm thinking about as mountains. I'm just cutting some shapes and doing some layering, and I'm thinking I'm liking this sort of mountainscape here. And I'm bringing in this other piece, which I really like and want to include, and seeing where it's going to fit amongst the other pieces. So I'm cutting it and trying to find where it fits. And then I bring in this piece of silk, which I think is a nice color, and I'm thinking this might be a good background for the rest of the collage that I'm building. Although, it becomes clear pretty quickly that I actually really like it on its own as a color. And so I'm starting to think about these other pieces that I've been including up to this point. So for some reason, I keep wanting to integrate this piece, and it's not really working. Keep cutting it down and fitting it, and I think I need to just let it go. And I can look at this as it is. This looks maybe almost like water, where there's some mountains, and this is the edge of the water. I may want to add more to this collage and decide this isn't water and do something else, but I think I like this the way it is at the moment, enough that I'm going to baste all these pieces down and give myself permission to add more later, because I may want to have all these other colors that I'm just not feeling like I want to add in right now. I feel like I just like these different tones of blue, and it makes this moon stand out. It's kind of a serene little scene to me. Right now, I think I might want to just trim the side of this mountain down, or at least tuck it under, because it seems like it's coming up a little too high for my eye. But overall, I think this is working. There's two other things that I want to do before I baste this collage down. One is decide which way I want this printing to go on the moon. Here it's straight across. Could go up and down, which I like. I like that better. The other idea is to make it diagonal. I think I like the diagonal better. Doesn't really matter a whole lot, but what it does for me is it moves the eye in this direction when you look at it, or this direction, and it just gives a little more movement and life to the piece, makes it look more organic. Again, doesn't really matter. It looks good in any direction, but I get to pick, and so I just want to be intentional about it. I'm going to have it like that. The other thing I'm going to do is this piece that's on the bottom is silk, and it's very thin compared to these fabrics. This is a batik, a quilting cotton. That's kind of a mid-weight, and this is dyed fabric. It's dyed navy. It's a muslin fabric, and it's the heaviest. So I've got the heaviest fabric, and it's kind of stacked up here, and then just one layer of this silk. And it actually would be fine if I just stitched it, but because there's just the thin layer and white underneath, I'm going to see what it looks like to add one more piece of this same fabric and just double it up. It's still going to be thinner than everything else with these two layers, but it might just balance things out a little bit more. It doesn't change it a lot in terms of the color. It makes it a little more blue than before with the two layers. See the single layer, you can kind of see the white through it. It's a very subtle difference. I think that it'll balance things out in terms of the thickness of the fabric. It brings this color out a bit more. It's not as washed out by the white. And for myself, when I'm stitching, it'll probably be nicer in my hand. I'll probably have more ability to make some nice stitches in here. I'll still have to be more careful about the fabric than I will here, but I think I like the idea of just doubling it up in that one spot where it's thin. So now I am ready to baste. I've pulled out some floss colors, And I think I've pulled probably more than I need, which is what I usually like to do. So first of all, I'm starting with these antique blue colors. And I've got it in 3 shades here. A dark, a medium, and a light. Not exactly the same, but I think all of these colors look nice on here. So I've got those. And then for alternate blues, I've pulled out this really dark navy type blue. It's sort of an alternative to black, which I can also use, and I always have black and white out. And then I've got these Wedgwood blue colors that I thought would go. And then one other shade of blue that's got less yellow in it, just in case I want to pull that color in. It's called Baby Blue Very Dark. So those are my blues. And then I thought I would grab a color in case I want to enhance this sort of gold brown color. This is hazelnut brown light. And then I've brought in some grays. So I've got a darker gray, and then a lighter gray, a silver gray. And then 2 of the beaver grays, which are more, if you compare them to these 2, see they're more of kind of brown family, yellow tones, in case I think that that's gonna look good. Just to have these options is really nice while you're stitching, that you can quickly grab in the moment. And then in terms of black and white, this fabric isn't a true white because it's like an antique, aged book page. So here's white. It's not exactly the same, but if I do bring this white in, it's going to make this seem more white. So that's an option. That's also why I have these lighter colors to sort of mimic white if I don't actually bring white in. And then I may just use these darker colors, this dark gray and this dark color instead of black, even though there is black here. And this strip that has black and white really mimics the black and white of the writing. So I could, of course, bring in my black, and I may do that as well. So I have my colors ready to go. I just put them at the top of the area where I'm stitching so I can see them while I stitch and grab them easily. And I'm going to baste down in colors that closely match. So I'm going to move around and start with the darker and lighter and switch back and forth. It takes a little longer to baste this way, but it's less distracting for me. I'm starting with this antique blue, and I'm using 1 strand of embroidery floss so that it doesn't show up. And so I'm using a smaller needle than I usually use, so that I'm just going to make really thin, small stitches. So the way I'm basting here is I'm just making small stitches and I'm moving around the piece. I've taken off the moon because it's just going to fall off. So I just move back and forth across the piece and then move down and across. Just enough stitches so that everything's secure. And then I just do a small knot at the end. If you've seen my videos before, I have said this, but it bears repeating that you do not have to secure your collage down this way. I do it because I enjoy it. It's part of the process. For me, I like it. It takes a little longer. Using pins or using some kind of fusible adhesive is a really good way to work. And I think probably for a lot of people preferred and makes their life easier. This is just the way that I like to work. I enjoy it. It keeps me in the moment. It's very slow. It's very relaxing. So that's why I do it this way. Other people try it and they They can't stand it. It slows them down too much and they want to move on. So in that case, you shouldn't do it. You should do exactly what you want that makes you happy. Okay, now I'm going to move on to a lighter color for these other pieces. I'm just taking the tiniest of stitches so that they're barely visible. I sometimes take out my basting stitches once the small pieces are secured, and other times I leave them in, and it's just about whether I see them and whether they distract me. My goal is really to leave them in, which is why I use matching thread, one of the reasons. But sometimes I take them out. Some fabrics are going to show basting stitches a lot more than others are. In these quilting cottons and heavier fabrics, they show kind of a medium amount. The thinner fabrics that I often use, like a cotton lawn, for example, they really show stitches. So if it doesn't integrate with the stitching I've done, then I do take it out. We'll see if I take these out. I'm thinking probably I'm not going to right now, but you never know once I get going. I certainly think down here on this area that the basting stitches are going to show quite a bit more. So those ones I may end up taking them out. Sometimes I do just take out the basting stitches from one section and I leave the other ones too. So see what happens here. Because I realize that these stitches down in this bottom on this really thin silk fabric may show, I'm going to be a little more intentional about where I place them. So what I'm doing is I'm running them in the direction of the fabric. This fabric has this really faint stripe. So I'm picking the areas that have the lighter stripe and I'm stitching in the direction of the stripes, hoping that they won't really show up too much. And I see that even as I was saying that, I did make a big stitch over here, so I can see this one. It's bigger than the others. So we'll see if that ends up making me pull it out or not. So that's everything basted in place as much as I need it to be. Let's have a look at the back. You can see where I've just hopped around, moved back and forth. So the only thing that's not secure is this moon. And it's kind of a mid-weight fabric. This is the cotton that I have it printed on. So what I'm thinking here is I'm not going to base this on at all. I'm just going to start with my stitching. It's a small enough piece that I'll be able to hold it with my hand as I begin stitching around it. So that'll be my next step. I've chosen this lightest antique blue. It's called Ultra Very Light. And I'm going to use that to stitch on the moon. I'm using a blanket stitch. And I'm coming in on the moon, and where I'm coming out is actually not on the edge of the moon. It's sort of right beside it on the blue. There's my moon, stitched on with a blanket stitch in a light color, light blue, silvery blue. And I have one other idea. It's not much of a surprise. I want to add a bird. It's nighttime. It's dark out. So it looks very black. I'm thinking about a loon. They're just the cutest. So this could be a loon. It could be a merganser. It could be a bufflehead, but I'm thinking about a loon. I've cut this out of fabric. It's very, very small. I'm using one strand of embroidery floss, and we'll see how I do. It's going to be tough to get it stitch it really well. We'll see. This is such a tiny snippet of fabric. And my strategy is to come up beside it and then go down into it. So here I'm coming up beside the fabric, and then I'm going straight down into it. When I stitched this little tail feathers, the fabric kind of disintegrated. There's just, when you think of the way fabric's made with threads going, there's a warp and a weft, you know, in two directions there's threads going. There's just not very many threads there to hold everything. So I'm looking at the beak, and it's going to be a similar situation with there's just hardly anything there. So I'm going to actually try and come up right at where I want the tip of the beak to be, knowing that this fabric, I may not be able to grab it. It may disintegrate. Okay, so here I am. And then I'm going to go straight in. We'll see what happens with the fabric. The threads in this fabric are thinner than the thread I'm using to stitch, so, well, that looks not too bad. That stayed on. And I'm coming up beside it again and going into it. Coming up right beside here, doing these last little few stitches on the neck. One more. Okay, there, our little loon is stitched on. So the stitches are straight up and down. So I'm not trying to do stitching of feathers at this point, and it actually looks pretty good. I will show some close-up shots so you can see how teeny tiny this is, and that these stitches have actually secured it down, which is great. Now I just need to turn this over and knot this thread. You can see on the back, I've actually taken quite a few stitches when you realize how small it is, but there we go. Now I've added a bird. I'm not too worried about things being completely in scale. I've got an exaggerated full moon. I've got a bird. I've got a mountain. I've got my water. A little loon. I am using this antique blue color, and I want to stitch down the edges of the mountain. So I'm going to start here, right where the two pieces meet. I am going to work over to the edge, I think, of this piece, and then work back and across the other piece. Now that I've done this first little mountain, I'm going to continue up in this direction and do the same thing I did, leaving some spaces in between for when I come back in the other direction. This is a way that I've found that's really a good way to start filling in stitches. And one of the things I like about doing this stitch is it makes marks. It allows me to make them thicker if I want to come in, put stitches in between the spaces I've made. And it's also easier to make these stitches farther apart. It's just a more natural, when you go in and you come out, it's easier with your needle than to make really close together stitches. This is a distance that feels really comfortable in my hand. So it's a combination of enjoying the process of it and the feel of it and the stitching rhythm, and the fact that it just makes really nice marks. I could have done stitches on these mountains going in the other direction. Instead of making these sort of vertical stitches, I could have done horizontal, also would have been nice. Just thought I would start with this and see what I thought. So the color is, it's a color that is complementary to both. It shows up more on the mountain than it does in the navy background, but I felt like starting with this with a nice complementary color. For my first pass, I just wanted these colors to be really complementary. So there's my first pass with these stitches. I think I'm going to continue and go down where this other piece of fabric is overlapping. I had started here and then I moved on to the other piece, but there is actually a second piece here. I think it can benefit from being highlighted. I thought I would come in across here where these fabrics overlap, kind of mend them together. Where they overlap here, there's a chance that as they pull and as the stitching happens that the white's going to show through, and so it made me think about just bringing them together and finding a way to just make them one. See how this looks. I'm using the same color. It's an antique blue that is lighter than the navy, so it's going to show up. I kind of like the way that looks, so I'm going to continue that with our next piece of fabric that's overlapping here. Kind of varying the angles of these stitches. It's looking in a way like it's been laced together. Because it's a color that's very close, so it's not a really stark kind of a thing. It's more subtle. So I'm liking it. I'm trying not to pull too tight because I don't really want to pull it in. It wants to pull together with this kind of lace, shoelace kind of stitch that I'm doing, but as long as I don't pull too tightly, and it's managing to stay fairly flat. There, here it is. I just stretch it out with my hands. There's straight lines, so it's also mimicking the lines I've done here. So that's some texture that's been added that I like. And because it's the same color, it doesn't stop me from doing some of the other things I have in mind. Like maybe I'm going to put stars up in the sky later. I'm staying with this same color, and I'm going to come in underneath our loon, and I'm going to make some stitches. And these stitches are going to be from the little wake that the loon is making as it paddles along in the water. Trying not to pull too tightly. I'm doing a sort of a back stitch here. It is going to help place this little bird in the water so he looks like he's floating. I think I'm just going to make that ripple a little bit more prominent, so I'm going to go back across one more time just with more of these back stitches. There, I think that's looking good for a start. Making our little bird look like they're floating. I'm going to knot off here, although I'm going to add more of this same color in the water. The next thing I'm going to do is just trim the sides of this a bit. It's going over where my felt is. I just kind of want to even it up with the rest of the sides. Still letting it come over a bit because I know that it's going to pull in as I stitch. So there's a little bit over on the top, a little bit over on the sides, a little bit over on the bottom. It's not completely straight here, so I'll just straighten it a bit while also letting it hang over. There we go. So it's looking good from the back. That'll just help me visually a little bit as I stitch, knowing where my edges are and making it consistent. Now I think I'm going to add some more stitching in the water here. I switched to the lighter shade of this antique blue, which is the same color that I've used to base this down. I'm just going to come across above where the bird is and do some stitching. So I'm just adding some stitches in this lighter color around the darker stitching that I'd put underneath this loon. Just trying to build up on this idea of ripples in the water that are being made by this bird as it swims along. And I'm going to come back in between some of these darker stitches and put some of this color on top of those stitches. Just thinking about reflections that would be in the water without making it look like a nest. I don't want it to look like the loon is sitting on a nest. I just want to make it look like there's some shadows happening. So that's coming along. I'm just going to keep on adding more of these stitches. They're kind of pulling and puckering the fabric a bit. I'm just trying to emphasize the idea of water. I have this hazelnut brown color, which is very similar to this golden brown that's in here. And I thought it would be fun to go around the moon and just add some blanket stitches. I'm not going to go in as far as I did with that gray color. What I think I want to do is just go maybe about halfway. And I'm going to go in between the stitches I took with the grayish blue color and come out just grabbing this light blue color to encase it in this round of stitches. So I'm back around to where I started with this round of blanket stitch, and I like the color that's being added. I may come around with another color as well and add, but I think I like this golden color, and so I'm going to go around one more time with this color just to add some more marks in between my first round. And I think that's going to add quite a bit. Just like I did last time, I'm making sure that I grab the last round to encase it in this new round of stitches. I think that's made the moon look like it's glowing. It's nice. Adding a few stitches in the water in this darker color that I'd put underneath our loon. Just going to add a few to complement the lighter ones. So there's some suggestion of water underneath the loon. And there's a nice golden color around the moon. And now I think I'm going to come in and just add more stitches on these mountains. Before I do hop up to the mountains, I'm just adding a few little touches in the lightest blue. This little area has caught my eye, and I just want to add a little bit to it before I move on. I was just thinking about the moon and how it can give its own light and cause its own reflections on water. And I thought I wanted to add some light to show the moon shining on the water as this little loon floats along. I think that the shape of the mountain, the moon, and a bird that appears to be floating in water is maybe as realistic as I want to be. And the rest of the marks I make will leave the interpretation up to the viewer. Whenever I make a landscape, I always think of it as semi-abstract because I put enough elements in that can be recognized as real things. But when it comes to detail, I like to leave that part to the imagination. So here I've got hills or mountains, a moon, water, and a bird that can probably be recognized by most people. I intentionally make them to be recognized. But then some of the details, like here, making these crosses, these X's, is obviously not realistic. It's hinting at something else. It's leaving the details of this up to the viewer's imagination. And I really enjoy working that way, particularly in landscapes, but in general, in most of my work. There's a push and pull between these two elements of recognizing things and using marks or symbols to represent other things. So here we are with our first round of marks on the hills. I like the color contrast, and I think the marks they're making are nice as well. So I'm continuing this mark making with these crosses, these X's, in this hazelnut color. I'm just coming to the end. I think I want to continue this right to the edge here. And I have some fabric that extends beyond where my backing is. So I'm aware of that as I kind of make these very last couple of stitches right near the edge. Just trying not to pull as tight, knowing I've just come into the edge. So this is looking good. I see right here, this piece of fabric has started to curl up from some of the stitching. So I'll have to think about trimming it, tacking it down. I think I want to do a couple more stitches here, right underneath. I have a tiny bit of thread left, so I'm going to come over here and make one more X to secure this piece of fabric down that's curling. I've managed to stay on my backing, which makes it a bit easier. And I think I'm going to trim this piece of fabric just a little bit, and it's going to line up better with the fabric above and below it, and it may help the curling problem I'm having. Either way, I don't need it there. I shaved just a tiny piece off. There, so there's my X's. Now I'm thinking about the moon, and I've picked this pewter gray color. And I'm thinking about making some marks on the moon. So I'm coming in with this marker. It's air erasable, so it's not going to be permanent. And I'm just going to kind of draw some lines where I'm going to try and either make marks or fill in. I don't know until I start exactly what I'm going to do, but if you look at a picture of the moon, there's these little areas that are darker than others. I want to hint at that because I think that right now the moon looks a little flat. It's very round, a little bit stark. So maybe these areas where I have the purple marks, I can just add some dimension to the moon and help make it look rounder and more moon-like. What I'm doing right now is kind of, I'm going to make an outline while this purple's still here before it disappears in the air. Just going to kind of do the same thing with the needle that I'd done with the marker. As I continue to make these marks, I'm keeping in mind that this is not meant to be realistic. I just want to hint at what's really there. So in no way is this supposed to be an accurate representation of what the moon looks like. Just an impression, and really these marks are to sort of give some shape and roundness, and also just interest. So it's not just a flat piece of fabric. So that's what I'm going for here as I continue to stitch and make marks. You know, one thing I'm noticing is that compared to, say, a photograph of the moon, these areas that are darker, a lot of them are quite round. But I don't know that I'm going to try and make them round more than I'm sort of making these almost scribbly, scratchy marks. I think now I'm going to hop down and just add a little more in this lightest blue color to try and show the moon's reflection. So just a few more lines here, just giving an impression. And I'm staggering where I'm making the stitches and the length of them. I'm going to try to make my next line shorter than this line, so they're not all the same length. And then maybe one more line here. I think that's nice. There's some reflection coming down from the moon onto the water. Little hints of it. Yeah, I think that looks good. I've got the medium blue color now that matches the water. And I'm going to come in and do some blanket stitch starting here. And I'm going to move around and see how that looks. I'm working with 3 strands of embroidery floss. I almost always use 2 strands. I'm just seeing what this looks like with 1 extra strand. I certainly can feel in my needle as I'm stitching that it feels thicker, and I can see that it does as well look thicker. This is just an experiment. I usually end up making a border that's got many rounds or that's thicker than the rest of my stitching. So this is a good way to just try this out and see what I think. I'm trying to gauge here where I want to place these stitches, because with this silk it extends quite a ways past where my backing is. And one of the things I'm considering is whether I want to put blanket stitch along the bottom. I may not want to. I may just want to do some stitching on the sides. Do something else along the bottom so that I can preserve this kind of raw edge look. In the piece that I'd shown earlier, which was almost the same size and also a landscape, what I had done is blanket stitching on 3 sides, and then along the bottom I had left this little piece of silk raw because I liked the way it looked, and I just added these little stitches. By coincidence, really, that's what I'm thinking about here with this water. I'm looking at these stitches I've made along here. I like them, and it's okay about maybe 1 more stitch to tie these together, but I think right now I just want to leave this raw at the bottom, and I could start the blanket stitching here and move up and then see what I think about it. So now I'm going to work my way up this other side. I've left the bottom, and we'll see how this looks. This same piece, this corner that had curled earlier, it's curling again. I'm trying to catch the edge of it in this stitch to hold it down. It's funny what a difference 1 more strand of floss makes, but I certainly can feel it in the needle when I'm pulling. I'm using the same needle that I use with the 2 strands. It's just that much thicker. that I can really notice the difference. It's just a little harder to pull through. Okay, so I've gone from where the mountains start down to the edge. Because the color is matching, it's not really noticeable. So it's not, if it was in a contrasting color, it would be really noticeable, and I would probably have a stronger opinion about it, but I think it looks fine. I don't think I want to go and stitch with this color up in the top area in the night sky. I think I'm just going to stop here and just leave this blanket stitching in these two areas. I want to add a darker color now in some spots, and I've been debating about adding this very, very dark blue that I have and black. Because I've added some black here with the bird, I'm going to start with black and see if I feel like it's too dark, then I can switch to the blue. So my first idea, I think I want to come in along the edges of this mountainscape. Just add some straight stitches that are going in the other direction. So these ones are going to be horizontal. The other stitches that I had added originally along the edge of this, they were all vertical. I'm just going to outline the mountains using a back stitch. I'm not sure at this point if I want to continue in this mountain with the black. I may, but for a start, I'm just going to do the outline of where these mountains touch this navy blue of the sky and see what that looks like. I find that I like this outlining with this black. I like the dimension that it's adding. So I'm going to continue with this black. I'm going to add it to this other part of the mountain, and I think I'm going to add some of it around the moon. I've completed the stitching on this part of the mountain. I think probably it would be nice to do some stitching along the bottom here where this is black and it's actually not as dark black. It's almost like a dark, dark gray. Maybe do some stitching here too. And then I want to stitch around the moon. And when I look at pictures of the moon, what I notice is that the outside edges of the moon glow. They're not black. They're actually very, very light because the moon's glowing. So while I want to outline the moon, I'm thinking about how close I want to go with my outline. So while I think about that, I'm going to go along the bottom here and complete this line that I've sort of started. I've stopped here. I'm going to do that. I'm using the back stitch here, which makes a nice solid line. And I'm able to make stitches that are not completely straight, and yet they're still connected with each other because I'm going back and inserting my needle where the other stitch ended. So this works really well for the way I like to stitch, where I don't have really precise lines, straight lines. And particularly because most of my subject matter involves nature. It's birds or flowers or hills or meadows or things like that. Nature doesn't have very many straight lines. There's always some variation. And so doing a back stitch gives a nice organic look. It's also a very forgiving stitch. If your previous stitch is a little higher or lower than you wanted, you can come above or below on either side of the stitch. You can come back and readjust where that stitch before is sitting. I'm trying to decide if I want to use black or this dark blue. So I've just draped them across. The bottom here is this dark blue color, and the top is the black. I think they both look good. What using the black will do is tie it in with the black outline I've already done. My concern with using the black is that it's just too dark and that a darker blue would be less stark. But I think because I've done such a bold line with the black, I'm going to try the black and see what I think, because what's happening with this outlining is it's making everything very what I think of as folk art. There's one style of painting that I do where everything is outlined in black, and I really like working that way, and this is what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of that same style. In that style, every object is outlined in black. So although it wasn't my original intention with this piece, as it's developed, it's becoming one where black outlines are really accenting everything, which means that most likely I'm going to outline the entire piece in black, however I decide to do that. So I'm going to go in and outline the moon in black, and I will put this blue aside. I still might bring it in. We'll see what happens. I'm not going to do a blanket stitch because I don't want this to be an outline of the moon in the same way that this lighter color is. To me, this lighter color is part of the glow of the moon itself, whereas this black outline is really referencing the background, the sky, more than the moon. That the sky is very, very dark, and the moon is glowing in contrast to the dark sky. So I'm just working fairly close to the moon and outside of it, which means that this black may not show up really well as I stitch it. I'm liking it. So if I do this one round and I find that I like it, but it's not bold enough, I can always go around again. So this is a good way to start, because you can always add more. Very rarely do I rip out stitches when I'm working. It's not to say I never do, but I tend to continue on and make things work. Sometimes I do second guess myself and take out something right after I've put it down, but I find that if I leave it, sometimes I find a way to integrate something that I initially was unsure about. That happened in the last piece I worked on, which was the dove, where I'd made the silhouette and I'd added white fairly early on, and I was unsure if I liked it, and I just left it and continued stitching in other spots. I came back to the white and it ended up being exactly the right thing. So that's just something I've learned over time about myself, is what works best for me is to not rip out something, just to leave it and wait and come back to it. So I like the way this is looking. It's very, very subtle because it's kind of getting tucked under the stitching that's around it. So I like this subtle outline of the moon. Adding this blanket stitch to the edge, and I want to see how I feel about it. My plan is to start here, where I've already got the black, and move around to here, and then see if I want to continue it down in the water. I think I'm going to need to, because adding this black has added sort of a weight and a heaviness. And so adding the black around the edges is going to balance that. And then it's not going to be on the bottom if I leave it. It needs to be sort of anchored in a way. So I'm going to have to find a way to add black that works with this water. I'm just eyeballing the distance here, not worrying about being precise. Keep them about an equal distance without being overly concerned about it being perfect. I'm just coming to the end here of this line of stitching around the edge. I'm gonna have a look and see what I think of it. And I do feel that I want to have some black around the edge, and I'm just going to continue with this blanket stitch and see what I think. What I've decided to do along the bottom here is to stitch just into this thin silk fabric, and it's a very delicate operation here. I could have stitched into my backing, and what that would have done is folded this in and made it shorter, but I wanted to have this extra few millimeters of length. I like the way it's looking. It's sort of frayed and uneven, which is nice. So I'm just going to have to carefully round the corner at this end, and then I will be back onto the backing, and stitching will be a little bit easier. I'm not going to pull too tightly, but I'm going to let it pull a bit and become a bit rounded. And then I'm just going to work back up to this spot up here where the black started. Okay, here we are where we started. Going to connect this thread to the starting thread, and there we are. I think that's nice. What I think it's calling for now is this area where there's this black and white, which now looks like gray and white, to do another line right up against where the water started. It will encase this black and white part. Well, I'm liking the way that this line is looking. It was definitely needed given that I've put so much black into this piece. Outlining this little strip has really helped, I think. I'm bringing back this color, this dark blue that's in here, and I'm going to add a little bit of it to the moon. So it can be seen, sort of blue tones on the bottom here. I think it's been worth adding. That blue really does show up, even though it's very, very close to the gray. So I'm glad that I've added that. Now I'm staying with that same dark blue, and I'm going to come down here thinking about just adding some stitches, short stitches, and varying the angle of them. This is to add some texture. It's not a huge contrast in terms of color, but I'm going to add another level just of interest in line. I like the way it's looking. This fabric on the mountain is kind of puffed up. It's mostly because of the outlining with the black. It's a heavy stitch because it's a back stitch. Look at the back. You can see it uses more thread. It makes a heavier line, and so it tends to pull the fabric in different directions. And in this case, what it's done is kind of made it puff up. So this stitching it'll flatten it out a bit. It'll integrate it more with the other areas that have more stitching. In terms of my basting stitches, I can't see a lot of them. I'm probably not going to take them out. I can see one right here. It's in that lighter blue, but I haven't taken any of them out. So I'm glad I took the time to switch colors as I moved around and basted everything. You can see them here because it's just one piece of floss hopping around, and they're sort of loose, but they're not interfering and they're not distracting me. So they're going to stay. And now I'm just going to keep making these little marks. The thing I like about these marks is they're not interfering with the nice sort of marbly effect, the color changes that exist on the fabric. I like that, and I don't want to cover that up. So I wanted to pick a stitch that would add some texture, but not compete with those lines, and that's what's happening here. So I'm happy with it. I'm just going to cover all these areas, these little lines of stitch. I'm working my way across this mountain area, these angled straight stitches, and I'm liking the way that it looks. It's definitely adding to the abstract feel. It's funny because I love working in bright colors, but with this piece I've really stuck to one color family, really, with just the accent of the golden brown color, and I'm really enjoying it. It's very different for me. So it's a nice change of pace in a way. Working in my style still, but really limited in my color palette, which has been, it's been really nice. I haven't felt constrained by it. I've always, throughout this piece, I've given myself permission to add in a color or do whatever feels right in the moment, and I've just continued on this very monochromatic theme. That's very different for me, but it's really working, I think, for this piece, and it's feeling good. It's still feeling like it's me. Almost finished with these stitches. Just have the last few to do. And then I'm going to move up to the sky, the night sky, and add a few details. So there's that. I think it's added a lot. I've got this lightest blue color, which is in the moon, my initial round of blanket stitch. It's down in the water, so I chose this color to bring into the background of the sky, and I'm just going to add a couple of French knots that are going to be stars. I think I just want a couple of more French knots right about here. I can't stop with the French knots here. We need more stars. Okay, there's some stars in our sky. And they're all twinkly. I want to add a few more stitches down in the water, and I'm just going to use the medium blue color. So it's not going to show very much. And my goal here is just to add some stitching to areas that don't have any. At this point, I'm not trying to do anything except add an even amount of texture to what exists on the other parts of the piece. So I'm kind of doing a sort of a running stitch, and I'm just going to place it around some spots that I notice that are a bit bare. This has added some texture, and I think a little bit of ripple to the water. So our water isn't completely calm, and it's not a placid body of water. There's a breeze that's happening. The water is moving, and this just adds a little bit of that water feel. I'm almost finished here. My thread is coming to an end, but also it may coincide with this area being stitched. We'll see here. I'm going to have a look at it once I finish this piece of floss and see if I think it needs any more stitching anywhere. Well, that's just so serene and calm. I'm going to go and turn on my iron and hit the back of it with an iron to sort of pull and straighten out any areas that have become wonky. Something occurred to me when I was over at the iron. I had this little strip of black fabric, and I put it underneath right here, and I thought, oh, that might be nice. I'm going to bring in my piece of white paper, have a look at it and see. It might be nice to add a little black border. It certainly looks good without it, but maybe it does add something nice. So I think I'm going to stitch it on and see how I feel. I just have to decide how much I want to show. I don't want to make it too tall. I kind of like the proportions that exist, but there's something about this that I like. So I'm going to stitch it on. I have two options in stitching this on. I can stitch it on this way. This is where the fabric's folded, so it would be a very clean edge. Or I could stitch it on where the edge is open and have more of a frayed edge, and I could even have the option of fraying some of the fabric at the bottom. So I've clipped it on this one end, and I'm stitching it from right to left. I'm not doing a blanket stitch. It's coming up through the silk and then down into the black strip. I decided to attach with the folded edge out, and that will give me the most options for how I want it to look at the end. It can look clean and folded, or I can cut it and have it frayed. I've worked my way up to the clip, so I'm going to remove it and finish stitching this. That clip really helped hold it in place, so it didn't shift around too much. Now I've worked my way all across and it's attached. I've attached it just right at the corners on each end. And so now I'm going to go back, and on the back here, I'm going to attach this raw edge. This is just going to secure this in place. I'm just trying to go through some of the backing, and I'm just grabbing the edge. Just checking that I haven't come through to the front, and I haven't. Now it's attached, and I'm just going to knot off here. Now I'm just going to clip to make this flush with the edges. This really is a serene scene. It's finished. There's a loon in the moonlight, there's stars, it's dark, it's quiet, and it's mostly in blue. So different from me. This was such a great project, and I feel like I've expanded in a way. I've branched out in a new direction where I'm working more monochromatic, and that's exciting. I'm so glad you joined me. Thank you for staying to the end. Bye.